Hi, I'm Peter J. Rea. Welcome. Today's topic is Thomas Jefferson, Part 5. Last time we stopped in 1802, and Thomas Jefferson was in the early part of his first term as U.S. President in Washington City, the newly built capital city named after George Washington, who had died about 2 years before. Now, President Jefferson was extremely popular. Remember, he was known as the author of the Declaration of Independence. He had been the leader in helping the United States become a land of religious freedom, and he founded the Democratic Party. Jefferson was constantly promoting the common man, and that was part of the appeal of the Republican Party, later renamed Democratic Party. The Federalists really had a sense of being for the elite, and so that's really why they faded away and why the Republicans became popular. On New Year's Day, 1802, the farmers in western Massachusetts made what they called the world's largest cheese, and they gave this to President Jefferson. It weighed 1,235 pounds. The cheese was accompanied with a note which read, quote, "The greatest cheese in America for the greatest man in America." So this big cheese. Later, Jefferson had a get-together. People came and to eat this cheese, and they got carried away. There was drinking, and some of the cheese ended up on the floor and got ground into the carpet. And then so the White House smelled like cheese for some time. In 1802, President Jefferson founded West Point as a U.S. military academy in West Point, New York. And the purpose was to prepare U.S. Army officer preparation. On July 4th, 1803, the following year, the newspaper The National Gazette published the news of the Louisiana Purchase. All land between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains was purchased from France. It doubled the size of the United States. It was the largest real estate deal in history, gave the United States control of the Mississippi River. And it was 830,000 square miles. The United States paid $15 million to France. The French Revolution, eventually, because of all the chaos and bloodshed, had led to the Napoleon Bonaparte dictatorship, and Napoleon needed money. That's why he sold all this land. The prize colony in the Caribbean of Saint-Domingue had been lost because Haiti had become independent. So the French actually were losing interest in America and in acquiring land in America. Now, for the Louisiana Purchase, the United States borrowed $11.25 million. And we were able to get credit because of Alexander Hamilton's financial plan, which had paid down the U.S. Revolutionary War debt from $197 million to $120 million. Okay, so actually the same day, July 4th, 1803, the same day that this was announced, this tremendous purchase that doubled the United States, Meriwether Lewis of the famous Lewis and Clark expedition received his final letter of credit from President Jefferson regarding this exploration in the West. So this was a big deal. The Lewis and Clark expedition, and which especially since the United States had purchased all this land, and so Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had this trip a trip west to explore, and the purpose of it was to make contact with Indian nations and have diplomatic relations with them, commercial prospecting, see what the business opportunities were, scientific investigation, and real military reconnaissance. This was a big deal, and the country's imagination was captured because we really didn't know what was in the West. In the age of exploration, which was primarily confined to the oceans, hadn't really gone inland, so people were curious, what's out there? And Meriwether Lewis had spent a year in Philadelphia studying botany, zoology, and the rudiments of medicine. Of course, if they got hurt. And he wanted to be able to identify plants. And of course, they actually identified many new species of plants on that trip. The U.S. Congress spent $2,500 to fund this expedition. It was the first scientific expedition of the United States. This was a big deal, and Jefferson was an enthusiastic supporter of it. As president, President Jefferson had a pet mockingbird named Dick that would sing to him when he napped and also would hop up and down the stairs after him. So that's a very nice little story. Jefferson was very sad because during his time as president, the trees in Washington City were being cut down. This was a wilderness which was being transformed into capital city. He felt very sad about these trees being cut down. And he wrote this, quote, "I wish I was a despot, that I might save the noble, the beautiful trees that are daily falling sacrifices to the cupidity of their owners or the necessity of the poor. The unnecessary felling of a tree, perhaps the growth of centuries, seems to me a crime little short of murder, and it pains me to an unspeakable degree." He felt so sad about these trees being cut down. But he was still, very optimistic about our country. Same year he wrote this, quote, 1803, "In the hour of death we shall have the consolation to see established in the land of our fathers the most wonderful work of wisdom and disinterested patriotism that has ever yet appeared on the globe." Jefferson had a visitor in 1804, Baron Alexander von Humboldt, who was a famous German explorer and scientist. So he was visiting with President Jefferson in the White House, and he saw a newspaper which had a lot of criticism of President Jefferson, very critical of Jefferson. And Humboldt said, "Why are these libels allowed?" And Jefferson responded, quote, "Put that paper in your pocket, Baron, and should you hear the reality of our liberty or the freedom of the press questioned in Europe, show this paper and tell where you found it." Freedom of the press that President Jefferson was supporting. Now, meanwhile, Lewis and Clark were traveling west, and they spent the winter of 1803 in St. Louis, and then they traveled up the Missouri River northwest into the Great Divide, and then they took the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean, where they arrived in 1805. In April of 1804, Jefferson's daughter Polly died. She was only 26, and she'd given birth and had complications from childbirth. So Jefferson lost another daughter. Of his 6 children, 5 had died, and this left only Patsy remaining. So he lost his parents, his wife, 5 of his 6 children. Very, very sad. In 1804 also, Aaron Burr, who was vice president, shot and killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel on July 11th in Weehawken, New Jersey. Very strange thing. And so this was the end of Alexander Hamilton. Tragic fellow. And, of course, this really hurt Aaron Burr's reputation. I was sad about the death of Hamilton because he was very talented, but he also there were problems in his character. So 1804 was an election year. President Jefferson was up for re-election, and he was the nominee of the Republican Party. The Federalists put up Charles Pinckney, and in the election, Jefferson won big. In the Electoral College, he received 162 electoral votes, Pinckney only 14. And so Jefferson was popular because of lower taxes, and there was prosperity, and the Louisiana Purchase. People were very happy about that because we got control of the Mississippi River, which was such an important thing. The Federalist Party was beginning to fade. Jefferson went to his second inauguration on horseback, and in his inaugural address he had this to say, quote, I shall need to the favor of that being, capital B, in whose hands are we, who led our forefathers as Israel of old from their native land and planted them as a country flowing with all the necessities and comforts of life, who has covered our infancy with his providence and our riper years with his wisdom and power, and to whose goodness I ask you to join me in supplications, that he will enlighten the minds of your servant and guide their counsels. He's talking about the role God had played in our country and the need to seek God's to seek God for wisdom. So Lewis and Clark were still out west in 1805. From North Dakota, they sent President Jefferson a box with skins and skeletons of antelopes, weasels, and wolves, along with elk horns, many plants, and 4 live magpies, birds. And so President Jefferson was overjoyed when he received these boxes. In 1806, Jefferson was starting to wear out from the pressures of the presidency, and he had another one of these episodes where he had a month where he couldn't do any work. It's because of severe headaches. He had to just stay in bed and rest because he probably was overworking. Another very sad thing, may have been connected to this, is that George Wythe, who was his law mentor and oldest friend, was poisoned to death by his grandnephew, and who wanted his money. Now Wythe had a freed slave mistress named Lydia Broadmax, and then he had a son from this woman who was a mulatto named George Brown, and this grandnephew, Wythe was going to leave his money to his son and his grandnephew. The grandnephew wanted all the money, so he poisoned these 3 people. It's terrible, and only Liddy survived. So this was a very, very sad thing for Thomas Jefferson. In October of 1806, Lewis and Clark returned to Washington City. They had reached the Pacific Ocean, made contact with many Indian nations, drew dozens of maps, collected flora, fauna, and minerals, and had compiled a vast amount of scientific records. And the United States was on its way to becoming a country from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So this was a big deal, their successful return from this trip. In 1807, there was big trouble with Great Britain, ongoing trouble. The British fired on an American ship, the Chesapeake, killing 3 and wounding 18 near Norfolk, Virginia. And it was the long issue, the biggest conflict we had with Great Britain over the years was impressment, where many men in the British Navy would defect and desert their ships and end up getting work on American merchant marine ships. And because if they could work for American ships, they were flogged less often and paid better. And then the British were trying to get these guys back. Of course, you'd think they could have treated the guys better. And the problem is they were very often capturing Americans. And then again, what about the rights of these British fellows? Were they slaves? So this was really an infuriating issue. The British kept doing it, and it was basically kidnapping. And there was war fever in the United States. Americans were furious about this because of this impressment, because they would actually get Americans. Anyway, so Jefferson, didn't really know what to do, and then his response was the Embargo Act. He put a ban on all international shipping for the United States. It was an economic disaster. This was the biggest mistake, I think, of President Jefferson's politically for Thomas Jefferson, because New England was really hurt badly by it. The thing is, these American ships, they knew the risks. They knew the risks of crossing the Atlantic Ocean, facing the British, but they went ahead and did it because you got to make a living. And so what this did was it threw all these companies out of business. A lot of men lost their jobs. These companies who were involved in shipping, their business was stopped. And so this was a big mistake, I think, by Jefferson. A lot of cotton and tobacco was unsold, and there was a talk of secession in New England. So this, I believe, was a mistake by President Jefferson. So, and he got a lot of criticism for it. We had this problem, but the government actually had made it worse. And he wrote this in 1807, quote, "I am tired of an office where I can do no more good than many others who would be glad to be employed in it. To myself personally, it brings nothing but unceasing drudgery and daily loss of friends." In 1808, Jefferson pushed for a law to end American participation in the slave trade. And he also, near the end of his term in office, he proposed a $20 million infrastructure project for improvements, for building roads and canals. And a lot of this was accomplished after his presidency, including the National Road, which was built from Maryland to Illinois. 1808 was another presidential election year, and James Madison was elected president. He was Jefferson's closest ally. So this was a vote for a continuation of Jeffersonian policies. President Jefferson came and left Madison's inauguration on horseback. So this was the end of his presidency in 1809. His very good friend, James Madison, became the fourth U.S. president. Thomas Jefferson had reduced the national debt from $83 million to $57 million. His belief in the common man and promotion of their rights led to the removal of property qualifications for voting. And this gave poor white men the right to vote. So this is a major step in the evolution of our democracy and really made the Republican Party, renamed Democratic Party, very popular. And this didn't happen right away, but it happened in the subsequent years. Because early on, you had to own property to vote. And these property qualifications were removed, largely due to the influence of Thomas Jefferson. Historian Joyce Appleby wrote this, quote, "The significance of Jefferson's assault on the venerable dogma of natural inequality that was based on the belief that most men and women were created to be hewers of wood and drawers of water for the favored few." So it was back to Monticello, this time for good. This was his retirement for real. And his daughter Patsy and her family lived with him. He had 11 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren and was known as the Sage of Monticello. Patsy and her husband Thomas Randolph had a home 2 miles away, but Patsy and the 8 children wound up moving into Monticello, she ran the household and took care of her father in his final years. However, her husband, Thomas Randolph, was depressed and resentful. He would come and go to visit. So the last 18 years of his life were at Monticello. He played with his grandchildren. He enjoyed that. They would have foot races, and he would drop a handkerchief to start the race. And then afterward, he would distribute prizes of dried fruit. Jefferson wrote this in 1809, quote, "I have often thought that nothing would do more extensive good at small expense than the establishment of a small circulating library in every county to consist of a few well-chosen books to be lent to the people of the county, under such regulations as would secure their safe return in due time," promoting public libraries for our country, which, of course, this became reality. That same year, 1809, Jefferson wrote this, quote, "I feel a much greater interest in knowing what has passed 2,000 or 3,000 years ago than in what is now passing. I read nothing, therefore, but the heroes of Troy, of Pompey, and Caesar, and of Augustus too, the ineffable luxury of being owner of my own time." So he was kind of fed up with politics and was interested in reading history. Upon awakening in the morning, it was Jefferson's habit to immerse his feet in a basin of cold water. I guess this helped him to wake up in the morning. During the War of 1812 with Great Britain, a battalion of soldiers visited Monticello, and one of the fellows wrote this, quote, "We drew up in military array at the base of the hill on which the great house was erected. About halfway down the hill, a very homely old man, dressed in plain Virginian cloth, his head uncovered, and his venerable locks flowing in the wind. People joked about who it could be, but how we were astonished when he advanced to our officers and introduced himself as Thomas Jefferson." That same year, Jefferson and John Adams were reconciled. It was a very nice thing because they had become estranged because of their political differences and political conflict. And Jefferson wrote this, quote, or John Adams wrote this, quote, "I always loved Jefferson and still love him." So they never saw each other again, but they exchanged letters. It was hard to travel back then. And Jefferson wrote this in a letter to John Adams, quote, A letter from you calls up recollections very dear to my mind. It carries me back to times when, beset with difficulties and dangers, we were fellow laborers in the same cause, struggling for what is most valuable to man, his right of self-government. No circumstances have lessened the interest I feel respecting yourself. None have suspended for one moment my sincere esteem for you, and I now salute you with unchanged affection and respect. So that was wonderful. They had reconciled, were friends again. Another letter to John Adams, he wrote this quote, I have given up newspapers in exchange for Tacitus and Thucydides, for Newton and Euclid, and I find myself much happier as enjoying reading history. He had many, many visitors, similar to George Washington. His granddaughter wrote this quote, people of wealth, fashion, men in office, professional men, military and civil lawyers, doctors, Protestant clergymen, Catholic priests, members of Congress, foreign ministers, missionaries, Indian agents, tourists, travelers, artists, strangers, and friends all came to visit him. So actually, one night he had 50 overnight guests. Again, there were no hotels back then, so these people would come. Anybody would come, and he would put them up for the night because he was a good host. He would have to feed them and wine and dine them. Use this expensive wine he'd purchased. One lady who had her parasol, like an umbrella. She jabbed at the window and broke the glass to get a better view of Thomas Jefferson. She was just imagine she was this what she had done. Broke the glass so she could see him better. In 1814, Jefferson wrote this quote, although all the nations of Europe have tried and trodden every path of force and folly in a fruitless quest of the same object, yet we still expect to find in juggling tricks and banking dreams that money can be made out of nothing. The crisis, then, of the abuses of banking has arrived. Again, he was very suspicious and critical of the banking system of the time, and I think we have the same problem today. In his retirement, Jefferson had ongoing financial problems, and eventually, he died had severe debt at his death. In fact, Monticello had to be sold when he died, and his slaves were sold after his death. It's very, very sad. In 1816, when the War of 1812, the Library of Congress had been burned. All those books were destroyed by the British. And to help himself financially and to give a new library, to have a new library for a Library of Congress, he sold his entire library to the Library of Congress, and the U.S. government paid him $23,950 for 6,707 books, and 10 wagons were required to take them away. After the sale of his books, Jefferson wrote this quote, I cannot live without books, and he immediately began to buy more. So the causes of his financial problems, he had neglected his farm during 40 years of public service, and he paid the social expenses of his presidency. He was very generous to his grandchildren and to beggars and to charities, endless visitors that he had to take care of. And he co-signed a loan for a friend that went bad. There were financial monkey business that was going. A lot of people, sometimes they would have financial problems. It wasn't necessarily their fault. But he did spend a lot of money on books, on expensive paintings, and, like I said, expensive wine. In 1816, Jefferson founded the University of Virginia, and the dome of the rotunda is visible from Monticello. Charlottesville is not far from Monticello. And again, one of his main interests in life was education. He believed in education. And so this was part of his quest to promote education. He wrote this quote, this institution of my native state, the hobby of my old age, will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind to expose every subject susceptible to its contemplation. Jefferson designed the campus of the University of Virginia, and he made it an academic village with lawns. There was grassy areas. And this became the forerunner of the American college campus, which has these grassy areas, and also a prototype of the American suburb. Jefferson was against gambling. He was very much against it, and he banned playing cards and dice at the University of Virginia. One student protested and broke a window in the rector's house and proceeded to throw in a deck of cards and a pair of dice. Jefferson wrote this, quote, "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves, and if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it away from them, but to inform their discretion by education." He's promoting education. He really believed in that. Quote, he wrote this, quote, "In a republican nation, whose citizens are to be led by reason and persuasion, and not by force, the art of reasoning becomes of first importance." He believed in the mind. He believed in learning. And we have to think. We have to use logic. We can't just bully each other and intimidate each other. It's very important to remember this today. Jefferson continued, quote, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." Yeah, this is very relevant today. We need to have respect. We need to be open-minded and respect the opinions of others and let them be, and don't condemn them if they disagree with what you believe in. Jefferson wrote this in 1816, quote, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be." It's so important for us if we want to continue to have our freedom, we need to be knowledgeable. Not just have schools, but really a love of learning. Such a wonderful example that he had for our country, which is very important today. Not just have schools, but really learn. Develop a love of learning, if we can do that in our schools. President Thomas Jefferson received many letters. In 1820, he received 1,267, and he was very good about answering them. It was said that he answered all of his letters. In 1820, remember, he'd had depression on and off. His wife had depression, and he was facing the challenges of old age. And it was reported that he had spiraling despondency till his death. And he was really sick with worry about his financial condition. And he also had physical health problems. He had rheumatism, an intestinal disorder, and again, he wanted to free his slaves, but he couldn't because of his financial condition. Another thing he felt very bad about is that Charles Bankhead was the husband of Anne Carey Randolph, Jefferson's beloved granddaughter. This was a very bad marriage, and Bankhead was a violent alcoholic. Anne once had to hide in a potato hole to get away from her violent, drunken husband. Jefferson feared that Bankhead would kill Anne, and he had almost killed T.J. Randolph, Jefferson's favorite grandson. So he was really facing some tough times in his final years of life. In 1821, Jefferson wrote this, quote, "The appeal to the rights of man, which had been made in the United States, was taken up by France, first of the European nations. From her the spirit has spread. The tyrants have allied against it, but it is irresistible, and the conditions of man through the civilized world will be finally and greatly ameliorated. It appears we're out of time. I wish you well. Live long and prosper. May the force be with you. God bless you. God bless the Philippines, America, and the whole world."